Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a very loose watercolour painting based on this photograph that I took somewhere between I think it's Wall's Brow and South Hill in the Cuckmere Valley. I'm not going to copy it exactly, I'm using it for very loose inspiration. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper, a 1/4 imperial sheet. It's taped to my board with masking tape, and my board will be at an angle of about 45 to 60 degrees when I paint. The first thing to do is simplify the photograph. So I'm just going to pencil in the rough position of the distant hill, the tree lines, the mid-ground hill and the foreground path, and maybe a few other things like bushes and things like that. I won't be painting the cattle in the fields today. I've never painted cattle before, so I'm going to leave that until I've practiced them a bit, because even though they look quite simple, I've got a feeling that they could be quite tricky to get them to look convincing in a loose painting. Now I think I'm just about happy with that. I think I'm going to have a very small distant fence that features in the photograph, so I'll include that, and there'll be a larger fence along the path in the foreground. The first thing I'll do is paint the sky, and so I'll mix up a fairly watery but well pigmented mixture of raw sienna, and using a squirrel mop I shall scrub in a light layer of raw sienna across the sky to start building up my cloud shapes. This is cobalt blue next, and this is the other colour that I'll use to build up the blue parts of the sky, and also where it blends with the raw sienna, some light cloud shadows. I'm using a larger squirrel mop to put the blue in, and I'm placing it in and around the raw sienna, leaving plenty of white paper for clouds. Softening here, I want some hard edges in the sky as well as soft edges. I'll bring it down over the hills. I'm quite happy to do that so that I don't get a hard transition between the sky and the land. Anyone that's ever been to the South Downs and the Cuckmere Valley in particular will know that when it's a cloudy blue sky day, you get these amazing huge billowy clouds just blowing in from the English Channel coming up across the valley, and it's quite spectacular. And so that's what I'm trying to get for this sky, even though it's very different from the photograph. So using a mixture of cobalt blue and a bit more water and the raw sienna, I'm dragging the brush across and painting in the distant hills loosely as an underpainting, and adding a bit of Paynes grey and more blue, and putting in the distant trees. Everything's still wet, so it will softly diffuse, but I'm hoping it'll give me a nice basis or underpainting for my finished piece. Very simply putting in now the mid-ground, using just the minimum amount of brush strokes, trying to vary up the tone a little bit, but I'm not too worried. I'm also not too worried about leaving bits of white paper here or having dry brush. In fact, I'm looking for that. I'm looking for the painting to be expressive, loose, and nice and fresh. More Paynes grey mixed in with the cobalt blue mixture to paint the foreground, and again to just strengthen up that main tree line a bit. It will all soften and diffuse. So what I'm doing here really is I'm painting in a lot of my mid-tones, because watercolour will dry a lot lighter. It always does, so you need to sort of put things in a little bit darker than you'd expect to start with, as it'll sort of lighten back by at least 25, maybe 30%. My lightest lights will be my clouds and any kind of reflected light on the landscape, and that's created by leaving the unpainted paper. This underpainting is giving me my mid-tones. When that's dry, I'll go in with some darks and details. Just softening back underneath that tree line a little bit, just creating a bit more variation to the tones. And I'm quite happy with that now as an underpainting. I'm going to leave it to dry completely and then come back and continue with it once it's dry. It's now completely dry, everything's softened back really nicely. So now I'll continue painting onto the dry painting to pull out some detail. I'm going to start off with my main trees here. This is Paynes grey, cobalt blue. I'm going to be mixing in bits of sepia and raw sienna into it here and there. I'm using my squirrel mop and I'm going to sort of graze across the paper at the top if I can for some dry brush, for some loose canopies and those small twiggy end parts of the trees, and then coming down into the underpainting and darkening up here and there, adding different mixtures of the paints that I just mentioned in order to try to add some variety of tone and colour into these trees, and to get especially to darken them up around the base of it. As I'm painting, I'm creating a small wet in wet environment in these trees, so the colours that I place now will colour mix to a certain extent and diffuse into each other on the page, as well as the mixtures that I'm mixing up on my palette. Trying to keep it nice and loose at the top if I can. Once I go in with some branches and tree trunks, etc. a bit later, having all that sky showing between the canopies hopefully will be quite effective. Just do the same sort of thing to the smaller bushes on the side. Now, I'm not sure about these bushes. I've got a feeling that the composition isn't going to work if I keep them the same sort of size as they are in the photograph. So a little bit later, when I've got everything else in, I might go back and turn those bushes into some more trees. I'm adding some sort of something and nothing detail of sort of bushes and undergrowth and twigs and at the side of the path. On the right side, the fence will grow from there. And this is just raw sienna for the path. We'll put some shadows across that later on, but for now I just want that nice earthy path colour there. Next, I'm going to quickly swap over to my small calligraphy brush and put in some sticks and twigs and just finer dots and dashes of detail into that tumble of undergrowth in the bottom right corner. And once I'm happy with that, I'll mix up a nice dark mixture of Paynes grey and sepia. And with the dark mixture, I'll begin to put in some fence posts along the edge of the path. I want to space them fairly unevenly as they are in the photograph. And as I go further back, they'll become slightly closer together and slightly smaller to indicate that we're going downhill, but also that it's going into the distance, so that we're getting a little bit of perspective. I'll add a few posts here and there slightly closer together as well. I'll do a few more in a minute. Now I'm going to change to the rigger brush, and using the same mixture, I'll quickly paint in the distant fence that's across the edge of the field in the midground. I'm trying not to be too fussy with this, just sort of little dots and dashes, and then join it up in places. So it's just that suggestion of the fence in the midground. I don't need much detail there. And now, using the rigger, I'm going to put in my horizontals across the fence here. The fences around this area, a lot of them are made with wire, and they're kind of, it's a sort of a mesh that's got horizontals and verticals with sort of square gaps, if you know what I mean. So I'm going to try and indicate that without painting it in too much details. So I'm sort of cross-hatching across the fence between each post, sort of unevenly, hitting and missing, so that I'm just implying that fence without too much detail. For a loose painting, it wouldn't work if I painted in every single line. It would look too exacting and a bit too stylised. So I'm not worried about this looking sketchy and scruffy. In fact, that's what I'm trying to go for. Now, still using the rigger, I'm going to suggest some grasses and foliage and things growing up around the base of the posts. I'm now going to just start to add a bit more detail to this left side. Well, not detail, just a bit more tone actually. Just a bit across the bushes there, and then I'm going to take my small calligraphy brush and quite a sort of a weak bluish grey, and using this mostly the side of the calligraphy brush to put in the distant bushes across the top of the hill. You could do this with the tips of the Harkey brush. In fact, it probably would have been easier if I'd done that, but I didn't think of it at the time. And finally, before I leave it to dry again, I'm using the corner of a chopped up store card and I'm going to scrape in some grasses, light grasses, into the moist thick paint, and here in the distance I will do the same, but creating some light reflected tree trunks and tree branches in that little copse of woodland. I'll try putting some in the bushes here, but I'm still not quite happy with the balance of the composition at the moment. I think I might have to do something quite drastic with the wood, with that little area there. So I've decided I need another larger tree over here on the left. So using my squirrel mop and my sepia and cobalt blue and raw sienna mix, I'll roughly get in a couple of large tree canopies, taking it off the tape so that when the tape's removed that I've got trees going off beyond the scope of the painting. I'll try again, dabbed off some of the water and moisture from the brush and try and get some dry brush canopies with the sky showing through across the top, and darken up across the base to put some shadows in. And I think that's a lot better. I'm much happier with the balance of the composition in the painting as a whole. And once I get tree trunks and branches in, that should be fine. So using the card, I'm just going to start that process off by scraping through the rich paint and creating a few pale lines. So now I'll leave all that to dry completely and then come back and do the finishing details. It's now all nice and dry, so using a fine number 1 rigger, I've mixed up a nice dark mixture of Paynes grey and sepia. I'm working around the tree trunks and branches that I've already etched and working with them so that it kind of enhances that. I'm putting in my tree trunks, leaving gaps where there's foliage painted, and then bringing smaller tree branches and canopies and twigs through the gaps and joining into the dry brush canopies that I painted earlier. If you paint along with this demo, take your time doing this. There's no rush because we're painting with wet paint onto a dry painting, so there are no time scales. It's worth stopping every now and again and just stepping back and seeing how the trees are looking, making sure that the rows don't look too regimented, if you know what I mean. So slightly different gaps between each tree, maybe slightly different angles to bring off the branches. I'm trying not to put in every branch, obviously, but just putting in enough detail to bring those blobby shapes that I've painted together so that the eye can interpret that as a group of distant trees rather than just marks on a page. I think this is a number 1 rigger. I'm afraid I don't know the name of the make. It was a gift, and any writing that might have been on the side has sort of rubbed off long ago. I'm going to make my branches a bit smaller and less trunks as I go into the distance with that copse. So I'm keeping the detail for the closer trees. Next, I'm going to do exactly the same sort of process over in this new area of trees that I decided to create. I hope you can see that things are balancing up now a lot more. I'm glad I made that decision to put in the extra trees, because otherwise I think all the weight of the composition would have been on the right. But now hopefully this just about balances it up, especially when I put some shadows across the foreground at the end. I'm bringing a few of my twigs out beyond the dry brush canopies into the light area of the sky, and they show up quite nicely. Just a few more dark details where I think it needs it. A few darker sticks and twigs and something and nothing in that tangle of undergrowth at the edge of the fence. And now just a few spots of darker grass and shadow underneath the fence line on the ground into the distance. Just a bit more work on that tree group there. And then lastly, using my large Harkey brush, I'm going to mix up Payne's Grey, Sepia, and bring across a nice bold shadow across the foreground. And underneath those trees. And I've just cleaned off my brush, and clean and damp, I'm making some slight adjustments to the shadow across the foreground until I get it to how I want it to look. Slightly paler as it extends towards the right. And I'm going to call it a day. I'm going to call that finished and remove the tape and see how it looks with a clean white border. That kind of gives us a fresh view of the painting. It's almost like seeing it almost in a frame, so we can see if it needs anything, any other details. But I think I'm quite happy with how it's turned out as a quick, very loose watercolour painting of this beautiful area on the South Downs. If we zoom in, we can see that the details very, very loose. It's just rough brush strokes. We've got some very nice granulation from the cobalt blue in the sky, and that's given me some lovely textural effects. And leaving some dry brush across the painting, I think, keeps it nice and fresh and lively. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.